This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 80. Corporate tax. Do we need it?
Hello, welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, corporate tax. How much does it influence the behavior of multinational companies? Do we need it? And what would happen if we got rid of it altogether? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, President Trump has been trying, of course, to drop corporate tax from 35% to 20%, which would bring it in line with corporate tax in the UK. But, of course, over the water in Ireland, the corporate tax rate is just 12.5% for trading income, which is why they're doing so well at attracting international companies. So is Trump right on this then? I mean, clearly he is. High tax is penalising business. It's forcing them offshore. It makes sense to cut corporate tax, doesn't it, Steve? But what about getting rid of it altogether?
Well, this is the intriguing thing because some of what's coming out of the maelstrom called Trump is obviously sheer chaos. But other times, some of the things he says and ends up doing for reasons that might be quite nefarious in their actual background actually make sense. And one of them is this whole issue of should we be taxing corporations? Should we be taxing? What is the role of taxes at all? And this is one of the most. You would have heard of modern monetary theory by talking to me often enough. But one of the initial statements of modern monetary theory is made by an American with one of those remarkable names that sounds like it comes out of some strange. Who was it? Was it Beardsley? Who was? There was actually a novelist called Beardsley,
right?
Or an artist called Beardsley. Well, here we have Beardsley Rummel. You might think is some effete artist working somewhere in the back blocks of New York. In fact, he's chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1945-46, and he was actually responsible. He was chairman before that period, so he's involved during the Second World War when the government dramatically expanded this level of activity to build the armaments to take on, first of all, the Japanese and then the Germans. And he argued in 1945-46, quote unquote, this is the title of the article, taxes for revenue are obsolete.
Right. This is the former governor of the Reserve, for the Federal Reserve of New York, saying this.
He was governor at the time, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. So effectively, Alan Greenspan, though not in the overall leading role of the Federal Reserve itself, but of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And his argument was that we think about, and we still do it today. This is one of the frustrating things for people who've been working, trying to bring some sense to how we think about money in the modern world. And his argument was back in 1946 that we don't need taxes at all to finance government spending. Our attitude is and this is a lot of people that are being opposed to dropping the corporate tax rate, say, well, if we drop the corporate tax rate, therefore we won't have the money to spend on welfare. Yeah. And so and they're like part of the Labor Party case in the UK has been to argue that we can reallocate taxes and reallocate spending to maintain the welfare state while still financing it and coming out with a deficit of zero.
Well, this is the opposition that Trump has faced and seems to have got over from the Republicans is, yes, it adds so much to the deficit.
Worrying about the deficit and the debt ceiling. And this is the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve of New York in 1946 saying that worry is irrelevant. We simply don't need taxes for revenue because a country which has its own currency and which has its own central bank can, with that combination, where the currency is not convertible into either another currency or into a commodity like gold, and this is quote unquote from the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1946, it follows that our federal government has final freedom from the money market in meeting its financial requirements. Accordingly, inevitable social and economic consequences of any and all taxes have now become the primary consideration in the imposition of taxes. So what he's saying is you have to look at the taxes not from the point of view of raising the revenue the government needs to spend, because that's not what they do at all. It's saying what are the social and economic consequences of the taxes you have in place.
So you're using tax rather than as a revenue tool. And we've spoken about this before. You're using it to influence behaviour rather than as a revenue tool in itself.
Yeah, and also the fundamental problem when you talk about the government being the scale it was after the Second World War, when it went from, like, if you go back to the 19th century, the American government was often equivalent to no more than 5 or 10% of the American GDP. After the Great Depression and the Second World War, we hit 35%. So if the government decided not to tax at all, which is one proposition you can find in Rummel's paper, what would happen? Well, you'd have an enormous increase in the amount of money in the economy, and that would mean your currency would have to devalue because you'd have a huge rate of inflation. So this is again quoting from Rummel. By all, as the most important single purpose to be served by the imposition of federal taxes is the maintenance of the dollar, which has stable purchasing power over the years.
Right.
Sometimes this is stated as the avoidance of inflation. Without the use of federal taxation, all the other means of stabilisation, such as monetary policy and price controls, are unavailing. All other means, in any case, must be integrated with federal tax policy if we are to have tomorrow a dollar which has a value near what it has today. So there he's saying the main reason for taxation is to avoid the consequences of creating too much government money, not that taxation is needed for government to have money in the first place.
So even if you didn't follow that line of thinking and we just looked at corporate tax, because people might, the idea of no taxation at all might be something that people have a bit of difficulty getting their head around. But corporate tax, I mean, it's such a small proportion of the total tax. So in the UK last year, it brought in about £43 billion, which out of a total government income of £716 billion, it's just 6% of government coffers. So small, you almost think, well, yeah. I mean, aside from income tax, corporate tax, do we need it at all if we've got all this money going to Ireland because corporate tax is so much lower? Just go even lower and say, well, the new level is zero, guys.
Yeah, and then you have to say, well, how do we actually bring that? If we cut out one of the tax revenue, a tax, not so much tax revenue, it's tax as a way of taking money out of circulation that's been created by government spending. If you've taken that out, quite possibly, you could say, well, now the amount of government money creation is roughly what the economy needs. Let's keep on going. So in this sense, I'm not at all worried about the corporate tax side of the tax bill. It's everything else that got attacked. For example, one element in the tax bill was to redefine life as starting at conception. Now, I don't quite know what role abortion has in tax policy, but that was actually something that was sneaked into the tax bill by the Republicans. So, it's the fundamental idea that corporate tax is potentially damaging industry. That's something you can find back in the 1940s from the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Because we're still taxing individuals who work for a company. Is there a need to tax businesses when we're already taxing the individuals directly?
Well, there's also the question of, again, it's a question of if you have government money creation on a grand scale, so that's the spending side, taxation then taking that out of circulation, then a question of how effective is that taxation in taking money out of everybody's pockets versus taking out of some people's pockets.
Yeah.
And if you then are very ineffective at taking out of some people's pockets, it accumulates in their pockets and they get to be wealthy because they manage to evade the circulation effect.
So you're saying that, I guess that's the argument behind corporate taxes, isn't it? For the people who are owning those businesses, at least we're getting them there.
It comes down to also just how effective is income tax in getting money off the extremely wealthy. And again, because we're seeing with first of all the Panama Papers and now the Paradise Papers, the extent to which wealthy people can arrange their tax affairs such that their tax liabilities fall in countries where they pay no tax on income or virtually no tax. And consequently, it all ends up being the working class on whom the tax incidence actually falls.
Yeah, and again, even not just the working class, maybe the shareholder gets hit as well, because if you abolish corporate tax, then what's the reason not to just hang on to your profit? You certainly don't need to be paying it out anywhere. You don't need to pay it in dividends because you're not paying tax on it anymore.
Yeah, it's so I've got mixed feelings about the corporate tax side of Donald Trump's policy. The reason for mixed feelings, of course, is because it's all in designed to increase the wealth of the people who, his social circle, who've all managed to arrange their affairs in such a way that they don't pay tax either. So what's going to happen is they have a dramatic increase in the amount of money they manage to accumulate out of the system because they're able to evade the incidence of the taxation we're using to take the money out of circulation. Now, the question is there another way of taking that money out of circulation that is harder for the wealthy to evade?
Well, who do you think is actually paying corporate tax in the end? Who are the people who are getting hit the hardest by it? Because it's not really the shareholder, is it? Because, I mean, the shareholder is, you could argue that the shareholder's worse off because of corporate tax, because there's less money being made by the company, there's lower dividends as a result. And, you know, if you take that to the natural conclusion, you could say, well, that's less of a reason to invest in, particularly in new companies, because the reward is reduced. So it's the proprietors of these organizations, isn't it, who are ultimately paying it?
Well, in fact, this is one of the important issues about not just taxation, but about debt as well. The question of the incidence of this tax. You might levy it in one place, but its incidence falls elsewhere. And I saw this like in terms of doing my modelling of Minsky, when I had the very simple model that simply had corporations borrowing money to finance genuine investment, and workers were just simply receiving wages, and that was it. When there was a runaway debt bubble, as we've seen in the real world, and as I simulated in my model before it happened, in that model, it was actually the workers who ended up paying for the increase in the level of private debt. So the complex interactions of the economy was such that capitalists pretty much bounced along at the same level of profit all the way through. The rising amount going to bankers was offset by a falling amount going to workers. So in that case, the incidence of debt payments fell on the working class, not on the firms that were actually doing the borrowing of the money. Now, a similar thing occurred when I brought the government sector in. So the government sector was then spending money based on the level of employment. So when unemployment rose, government spending would also rise, mirroring what happens in the real world. And in that situation, again, the incidence fell on the working class. The working class share of direct income also dropped. But what you had was the spending was being done by the government on the working class as well. So what they lost in terms of a wages share of income, they gained in terms of a larger amount of spending by the government sector. So we have to look at the incidence of these things as well. And if we did have the incidence falling on workers and not falling on capitalists, then if government spending is also on workers at the same time, that effectively compensates what they've lost out of the wage bargaining situation. So I'm fairly in favour of just saying, okay, we're going to have the government has to generate a deficit. It's creating the money itself. This is the Beardsley-Rummels point. It doesn't actually need to borrow money from the private sector. It doesn't need to tax. It can simply create the money. It's then a question of how much does it create. And if the government's obsessed, as governments has been, with creating with running surpluses, they're trying to destroy money in that case. That's really the mistake, rather than where the taxation incidence falls.
Right, but tax is still needed because it's trying to influence behaviour and trying to ensure that we haven't got a runaway divide between the wealthy and the poor. And
also, we do have runaway inflation, so you have that combination of issues.
But also to help with your balance of trade as well. So I'm thinking, isn't this a bit where corporate tax comes in? If you follow the island model, then you are getting a lot of foreign investment. Is that helping your balance of trade?
Yeah. So I'm, to me, we have to just think about redesigning the taxation system.
And I'm trying to figure out where corporate tax fits into it. Is it good to have it or bad to have it? So, I mean, because I started by asking you the question, do we get rid of corporate tax altogether? I mean, is Donald Trump heading in the right direction? But you could go the other way, and you could argue, we're getting more automation now, and it's very easy, it's becoming easier to set up, if you've got the capital, to set up a company that's not employing people, in which case, you're keeping all of that profit yourself. You could say, well, there's an argument, you should be increasing corporate tax, reducing income tax. So we're making money from those companies that are not employing many people and stopping them generating so much wealth. It's unbalancing the economy.
Yeah, and this is the other possible way to look at it, is say, well, what is the role of taxation? It's to take money out of circulation we don't want to leave in circulation. What is that level? would a transaction tax work just as well as an income tax in doing that? And so transaction tax is going to be paid by the corporation, like a corporate version of VAT. And then when you fine tune that, so you simply stop the you set a target for the amount of additional money the government's going to create each year by its spending, and that becomes the major reason for setting a tax regime, rather than thinking you've got to finance government spending in the first place. Now, that could mean taxes on corporations based on transactions, because taxes based on corporate profits are much easier to relocate overseas, and that causes the sort of dilemmas we see with Ireland on one side, with the Cayman Islands, the whole Paradise Papers, and so on. It's all done because you can evade income tax by relocating where your income is allegedly earned. You can't relocate the transactions. So I'm very tempted to consider starting off with a system which has transactions tax on corporations as well as income tax, and then you end up paying whichever is the greater of the two, and ultimately get to the stage where transaction tax completely replaces the corporate income tax.
Right, and you could have, if you're doing that, you can have a less regressive income tax as well. You could say, well, we'll use income tax as a way of ensuring that lower income earners are paying less in the way of tax. Those corporations are holding a greater share of the total tax bill. I know we don't necessarily see it as a bill, but when we say 6% of it is coming from corporations, the rest of it is coming from individuals, you could tilt the balance the other way, I guess.
Potentially. I mean, again, this is the sort of thing I'd like to model in my Minsky software in fairly detailed way, because again, you can't know the incidence of something like a taxation policy in a complex system just from suck it and see type statements. Because if you think, well, if you impose for example, in my Minsky model, if the firms borrow the money, then therefore, of course, as debt rises, firms must have a larger amount to pay out, so they must be the ones who pay the incidence. No, that's not what happens. It's actually the workers who end up paying by a lower wages share. So you have to look at the complex feedbacks that exist in the financial system to work out where the incidence will actually fall. But the main thing to change is the mindset of believing that you need the taxation to finance government spending in the first place, and therefore if taxation is lower than you would like it to be because corporations are evading tax and the wealthy are evading tax, therefore you must spend less. That's the fallacy. No, you spend the same amount.
Right.
It's then the impact of that spending on the domestic economy, then this is the inflation issue. But we are so far from the inflation issue right now that I'd be willing to wear that consequence and just say, it's liberate the thinking from the believing you actually have a debt ceiling in the first place.
But Trump's thinking is right when he starts thinking about it on an international basis, that there is international competition and corporate tax is front and center of that.
Yeah, and that's again, corporations, because multinationals operate between national boundaries, they've been able to exploit this on an enormous scale. So that's where places like the Cayman Islands have grown into being tax havens. And I remember, so you would have seen the report with the Paradise Papers of a 5-story building, I think in the Cayman Islands, that was responsible for about half the world's corporate tax or corporate profits. I actually went there when it was a 2-story building, and this is about 20 years ago. So corporations have been dancing their way around these limitations for decades now. And partly the reason why the dance is so complicated is we force to believe we need to tax them to get the revenue for government spending. If we get that out of our heads, then we can start thinking about a more sensible way of designing a taxation system.
Right.
And as part of it, a lower. You could go as Beasley Rummel recommends here. You said you could go to a zero rate of corporate tax because he said the money. I mean, again, his interpretations might be lacking the vision of a complex system. But he says the money taken from corporation taxes must come in one of 3 ways: from the people in higher prices, from the corporation's employees and wages, and from the corporate stockholders in a lower rate of return. He said no matter what source it comes from or what proportion, the tax is harmful to production, to purchasing power, and to investment. And that's pretty much the the starting point that Trump has. Right. He also mentions how the tax on corporate profits distorts managerial judgment, and also he said double taxation, which of course there's you get taxed on your income, and the corporation is also taxed on its income before it pays you dividends. So,
well, we've got double or triple taxation all over the place. But I mean, if we're looking at that as the argument, though, that that by getting it down to zero, we sort of won the race to the bottom when it comes to international competition. I mean, corporations have no incentive to be based in one place versus another because tax has disappeared off the equation. That sort of kind of makes sense, but then that doesn't help the other side of the equation that we've been talking about, which is how do you moderate the behaviour of the capitalists and the financiers who are reaping all the benefits and potentially then paying no tax whatsoever.
Yeah, but again, it's a case of you want to stop that accumulation building up of wealth. And maybe there are better means to go about it than the taxation system. Again, this is one reason I argue in favour of a modern debt jubilee, because a large part of the wealth has come out of the leverage we've allowed to have behind financial assets. Now, if you use the government's money creation capability to cancel a lot of that private debt, reduce the leverage and reduce those prices, you would actually do more to attack inequality that way than you can do through the taxation system.
So finally, don't you find it curious that we have the EU allowing Ireland to get away with doing what they're doing? In other words, undercutting everybody else on corporate tax.
That is weird. I mean, I must admit that's one which you look at and you think, the Irish have played a good game at the European Union's expense. Why do they let them get away with it? Now, of course, one of the reform attempts inside the European Union right now is to prevent that happening. And the Irish have been fighting a rearguard action against changes to corporate tax rules in the European Union in general, which would ban the trick they've used to drag foreign corporations onto Irish soil.
So I'm feeling a little disappointed today in that I wanted a yes or no answer. And what you're telling me when I asked the question, do we need more or less corporate tax? Your answer is, well, yes,
I would say
yes, possibly. What you're saying is we need to model it. What you're saying is it's complicated and we need to do modelling on it.
I'm saying that the incidence of the tax doesn't necessarily fall on the group in which it's imposed. And I'd like to know that answer better as to which way it is. But the real problem isn't the taxation side. It's believing the taxation controls what you can do in terms of spending.
Yeah.
And if we can get rid of that particular control, then I'd be far less worried about a cut in corporate tax. The trouble is the cut in corporate tax, again, in the United States is being tied up with a cut in welfare spending as well.
Yeah.
And
a cut in income tax.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is unnecessary. If you say, well, we can cut the taxation rate, we don't have to cut government spending. It's belief that one leads to the other that's a large part of the reason we're in the chaos we're in right now.
Yeah, well, look, it's going to be an interesting experiment to watch then, isn't it? Because assuming that it all goes to plan, I mean, there is a cut in income tax, there is a cut in corporate tax, there is going to be growth in debt in the United States, and the big hope is that they will, that the laugher curve will come into play. They'll see their revenue go up, but in any case, they'll see their productivity increase as a result of less tax. Is that what's going to happen?
Well, I mean, that's the question. Will the money actually end up being invested or not? And that comes back to the scope. The major determinant whether you invest or not is whether you expect profits, and that comes down to the demand you're getting out of the economy. And if the demand is being drastically reduced by massive inequality in income distribution and very low wages for the workers, which is where the low inflation is coming from, then you won't necessarily see investment at all. You'll see that money again being pocketed by the wealthy, which we're talking Trump land here.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to watch, isn't it, over the next couple of years. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Steve. Catch you again soon.
Okay. Yeah.
And look, if you're listening to this fresh in the last week before Christmas, have a good Christmas break if you're having one. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time asking if GDP is the right measure for determining the wealth of a country. And as you might expect, Steve Keen has an alternate measure, which we'll talk about. But you're going to have to wait till 2018 to find out that one. Not too many days into 2018, but that's when we're back. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the new year.